Welcome back to Forward Progress, part of the Hammer Betting Network. I'm your host, Jason Cooper, alongside Ken McKusick, the film study analyst for 1057 The Fan. He's also the host of Film Study Baltimore Ravens Talk of the podcast, which you can find on every podcasting platform out there. You can also check out his website at filmstudybaltimore.com. Check him out on YouTube, and you can follow him on X. His name's obviously Ken McKusick, but his name on X is Film Study Ravens. And guess what? Today we'll be covering everything you need to know about the Baltimore Ravens in 2024. Before we get started quickly, I want you to comment down below how many wins you think the Ravens will get in 2024. Let's jump right into it. Ken, before we start looking forward, we must look back. The Ravens, of course, dominant season last year, but again, came up short. Before we discuss 2024, tell us a little bit about 2023. Give us one word or a phrase to describe the 2023 Ravens season.
Yeah, dominant but frustrating, and obviously for Ravens fans. And Ravens fans are now at a point where they complain about the postseason. They almost plan for the postseason and how not to fail then, without oftentimes consideration for needing to get through the regular season. Somebody asked me to do a concerns podcast just recently as an aside, and they wanted to do something about play calling or adaptive play calling in the postseason. I'm like, well, maybe we ought to have some concerns about the regular season first here, because this is a very good football team. They're one of the greatest football teams of all time last year. They won't be recognized as that, and neither will the 49ers, because neither of them eventually won the Super Bowl. But if you look at statistics like DVOA, they were up in the top teams the last 40 years.
Yeah, and that's almost like the curse that comes with being such a good team, is that, again, only one team can really win, and you kind of forget about the silver medals and the bronze medals and the teams who just come up short, and those teams kind of fade into existence. So it's a tough thing to swallow until you can get that win. There's going to be doubters throughout the way. But let's talk about this season now. Let's talk about leading it up to this season and a little bit about the offseason here. Biggest loss I found just when looking into the Baltimore Ravens was obviously the loss of their defensive coordinator, Mike Macdonald. You mentioned it. They're top in DVOA. They were top defensively in DVOA. They were top 3 in EPA per play, top 7 in success rate. They did such a great job at executing this kind of positionless style of defense and did a great job confusing opposing quarterbacks. One of the most interesting stats I found was that they had one of the lowest blitz rates in the league, but they somehow led the league in sacks, which is pretty cool to see. So Zach Orr steps in. He's their new defensive coordinator. He's a first-time play caller, but he's been with the team since 2024 first as a player, then became a defensive coach. So just tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the hire of Zach Orr. What have you heard about him, and kind of what you expect this defense to look like, if it will look differently under a new defensive coordinator, or will the same philosophies kind of be there from Mike Macdonald?
Okay, so internal hire, first of all. The Ravens do a lot of that. They hire from within. They end up growing their bushes and trees of coaching talent that have gone elsewhere. And this last year was a lot of coaching talent lost, in particular on the defensive side of the ball, with Denard Wilson, the secondary coach, going on to the Tennessee defensive coordinator job, and Weaver going to Miami. There's a really great defensive line coach lost. That's a shame. And Macdonald went, of course, for the big job in Seattle, a big money contract with them for, I think, 6 years. Zach Orr is elevated from an inside linebacker coach, where he played for the Ravens in the mid-2010s. He came from a committed nickel system under Dean Pease. He was, in fact, the committed nickel part. Now, what do I mean by that? The weak side linebacker often comes off for a dime back in a lot of modern defenses, and it's one of the big differences defensively you see in terms of scheme from team to team is, are they committed to having the nickel on passing downs, or do they replace that weak side linebacker with a dime back? Well, the Ravens in the Orr era, because Orr was a hell of a coverage player, were a committed nickel team, and I think there's a tremendous bias for Orr to continue what Macdonald left behind in terms of a committed nickel team. And I'd say the Ravens last year were a committed nickel team largely because of personnel. They had Patrick Queen as their weak side linebacker. They have Roquan on the strong side, or on the Mike. And those two you wouldn't take off the field typically. And so there wasn't really a dime back. It wasn't really an option. This year, Trenton Simpson steps in for Patrick Queen, who went to the Steelers, and has a lot of similar traits. Might or might not be as good a coverage player, might or might not be as good a run defender, and the Ravens may have some adjustments to make to decide whether they want to be a pure committed nickel team, whether Simpson's an every down player, or whether they're going to stick with they whether they stick with that or whether they move to a dime back situation where they bring in a safety to play that position. So anyway, I'm a big fan of dime defense, by the way. I think you gain a lot in terms of protection from injuries, in terms of cap cost and whatnot, by having effectively a platoon role at that weak side linebacker spot. But that's just a part, honestly, of the defensive scheme with Macdonald that a lot of people were really sad to see go. He had a cover 2 shell that he started with on the vast majority of plays. That cover 2 is extremely intimidating to opposing quarterbacks, particularly those with kind of weaker arms for deep throws. Joe Burrow falls into that category as being someone who doesn't really want to test the deep middle of the field with 2 safeties back there. But they also rotated out of that a lot, rotated down into, used some robbers to come in and take away routes underneath with that second safety, and had Williams cover the deep part of the field. They played a fair amount of cover 3 like a lot of teams do, and they really made, by having 2 safeties back, it made their cornerbacks much less vulnerable. And they had some weakness at cornerback last year. It looked like that was the very weakest position going into the season. As it turns out, Brandon Stevens in his 3rd year turned out to be the right cornerback. It's like you had an ugly duckling who became a swan all of a sudden, and was the right cornerback who played almost every single play for the year. And then they had Humphrey was injured and in and out, but Ronald Darby was really the glue that held the team together at left cornerback. He's gone now. They've drafted 2 new cornerbacks. Humphrey hopefully is back and healthy. Stevens is still on the other side, but they got 2 of the best cornerbacks in the draft. Nate Wiggins, who was drafted number 1 in the first round by the Ravens at number 30, and I think he was a top 15 talent in the draft. He was my number 1 cornerback on my board. I'm very excited that they got him. I wanted a left tackle, but they're very excited that they got Wiggins of the corners they could have had. And then they also drafted TJ Tampa a little bit later. Very successful cornerback in college. Stock dropped a little bit because of his speed profile, although I think his physicality really offsets a lot of his speed issues. He was still number 6 in terms of cornerbacks on my board, and they got him in the 4th round. So very excited in terms of the new corners. And I think the coaching change, I don't really like the term positionless defense. I don't think that's what the Ravens do. I think they play players with atypical traits for positions sometimes there. And they were all through their history, they've done a lot of this in terms of being some early adopters of the dime packages and even the quarter packages. 2000 team played 34.5% dime and quarter packages, meaning with 6 or 7 defensive backs on the field, which is incredible because all anybody can remember about that team is the names of the starting 11, and that there were 3 journeyman defensive backs who were on the field for a lot of high leverage plays that year. It's kind of forgotten about it. But anyway, in terms of what they've done, the major difference is Kyle Hamilton is kind of I like the term queen of the chessboard, the guy you move around all over to do whatever you need. And he can rush the passer, he can cover a slot receiver, get very physical with him. He's a great short zone defender. And because he's so tall and long armed, he presents a very significant target to throw over. And so he will make quarterbacks think twice about any mid-range throw over level 1 and in front of level 2. So it's a good thing to have, and Hamilton certainly is the star of this defense, and a player who the Ravens really need to maintain the versatility of. So we get into talking about the defense anymore. They're kind of a short the back end safety that they had last year in Geno Stone from allowing Hamilton the freedom to move wherever he would like on plays.
Just out of curiosity, and just quickly here, how much of this defense relies on Hamilton and his health? Like, again, you don't want to risk injury or think about someone getting injured, but like, how much we won't know until it happens. But how much do you think this defense will change if you were to ever get hurt?
Hamilton is absolutely critical. He was hurt some last year. He also got ejected from a game for a helmet-to-helmet hit, which was unfortunate. But it's the entire safety group has to maintain health, because in order to have the flexibility to move him where he's most effective, they need to have the other safeties to play deep. So while you hear there's a specific term I'll tell your listeners to listen for. When you hear the term flexible safeties, your antenna should go up, particularly from a betting perspective, because what it really means is they don't have a free safety and they have multiple strong safeties. The Ravens have multiple free safeties, and they had 3 last year. They're down to 2 this year. They don't want to be in a position where you really don't have 2 who can play the back end, because Hamilton himself is not miscast, but underutilized playing on the back end in a cover 2 scheme. He's much more valuable playing up closer to the line of scrimmage.
All right. And then also just a thread I'm going to pluck on here that you mentioned earlier. You talked about them taking Nate Wiggins in the first round and how you wanted maybe them to go look at a tackle. And that's what I want to talk about right now is the offensive line. If you feel like there's any issues there. Of course, this past offseason, they lost Kevin Zeitler and John Simpson. They also traded away Morgan Moses. Seems like they wanted to get ahead of age, I guess. Would rather move on from guys a year early than a year late. They didn't really bring anyone in free agency. They're looking to promote from within. They use a second-round pick on Roger Rosengarten. So talk to me a little bit about this offensive line, what you expect from it, who you expect to be starting in week 1, and how you see them playing this year.
Okay, so the easy positions to talk about are left tackle, where Ronnie Stanley's returning. Had a terrible year last year. PFF's grading is extraordinarily generous for him. I score offensive line play. I saw it very differently, and this was by far the worst year of Stanley's career. He did play very well in the last 4 games, which is the really nice thing. Completely different player in those games. Looks like he could be back. You hear talk this time of year about he's healthy, he's never felt better, blah 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 blah. But you hear that about every player. So you can't take that too seriously. With Ronnie, it's all about the best evidence we have that he might be back is the last 4 games of last year. But the Ravens cut off the 2025 season of his contract. He wasn't going to be retained. The Ravens would have cut him for a $20 million cap savings next year anyway. And they also reduced his salary slightly for this year. But he's staying, and I hope that he can have a big year. Unfortunately, will probably be his last year as a Raven. So the Ravens have a left tackle problem to solve, which we'll get into in the other positions. Center is the second easiest position. Well, it's maybe the easiest because Tyler Linderbaum broke out, had a really big year as a pass blocker after a really lousy year as a pass blocker as a rookie. And that was the biggest single improvement, other than maybe Brandon Stevens at corner, on the entire Ravens team. He needs to step up in a big way, not only in terms of his play, maintaining, I would say, at the same level, because I think he's gonna have a year of consolidated gains. Even though you often would project improvement for a player in year 3, he's gonna have 2 new guards playing next to him, and that's going to be very challenging. Kevin Zeitler, you mentioned earlier, was instrumental in the line calls and a lot of the coordination of what was going on. He does not have such a player next to him now, so it's all on Linderbaum. I think he's probably ready for the responsibility, but we won't know until we actually see it against live fire, and that won't be until the regular season begins, because these guys won't play at all, or only a few snaps in the preseason. So that'll be interesting thing to see. Now the positions in flux, and they're more important. The left guard position, Andrew Voorhees was a 7th round draft pick in 2023, but the Ravens acquired the pick from the Browns. So this could have some delicious evil to it over the course of time, that they got this pick from the Browns again, the same way that they traded up 1 slot to get Haloti Ngata and traded a 6th round pick to do it in 2006. But anyway, the Voorhees they got with a 7th round pick. He had the leading total of 38 bench reps, which he established at the combine after he tore his ACL there. And so he still got on the bench, did 38 reps, more than anybody else. So it's not a question of grown man strength with him. There are other elements that go into being a guard that I'm not 100% sure of, but John Simpson was the guard last year. He had a big penalty problem, was otherwise a decent pass blocker. But the Jets really, I think, are going to get the rifle butt end of John Simpson, frankly, because if the Ravens' offensive line coaching can't fix his penalty problems, I don't see why the Jets ought to be able to do it with their history of OL play. So anyway, we have that. Andrew Voorhees, tall and lean, so despite extreme strength, he may not have the great anchor that you would expect. I hope he's able to move the way the Ravens expect him to do, but the Ravens have made some very average athlete athletes into good pulling guards, such as Bradley Bozeman, for example, who very average athlete, James Hurst, who played a year at left guard. Tremendous pulling responsibilities for both players in terms of sheer volume, because the Ravens do it a lot. And that'll be true, I'm sure, of Voorhees as well. So expecting a lot from him. And he was really known for his pass blocking in college, which is the more important thing anyway, but hopefully he'll get the run blocking good to go. If we move on to right guard, so Ravens let Kevin Zeitler go. Looking at the price tag on Kevin Zeitler, it seems like it was awfully cheap. I think you're hitting it correctly, that they're a year earlier rather than a year later. And players in their 30s in particular, there's a risk that they will sign a 2-year contract with the expectation of only playing 1 year. And you don't want to get held. You don't want to get the last old maid contract for any player, where injuries or ineffectiveness obviously decrease their value. And so they moved on from Zeitler, who did have some injuries last year, didn't have his greatest year, but he was probably still the Ravens' most consistent lineman. That was certainly true. Even Linderbaum has a fairly significant up and down pattern through the year, but Zeitler very consistent in terms of how he scores game to game. I'm excited that Ben Cleveland, who's an enormous human being, is going to get a chance at right guard. He's played well there, and they've kind of held him back from playing other positions, left guard most notably, and right tackle potentially last year. They've held him back from playing other positions because they really believe he's a right guard. He was that at Georgia. Very good inside to outside processing skills as a pass blocker. It's extremely valuable. He's also just enormous in the run game, and he can push people around. So hopefully he fulfills on the promise. This is his 4th year. The Ravens have often been in a position where their linemen break out in their 4th year and then immediately go to the market, make a lot of money, and the Ravens get a comp pick. So that it has been just a regular thing that's happened. Ben Cleveland, it's not enough of a payoff for that to happen. Since he was a 3rd-round draft pick. The Ravens wouldn't look to do that, but a lot of their guys who have done this have been 4th, 5th, and 6th-round draft picks, and then it's plenty fine of a return. So Cleveland, big man, hopefully is very effective playing next to Linderbaum, who is a smaller man but very quick. So hopefully the both guards, that's a good relationship for them. Right tackle Morgan Moses, you mentioned, traded to the Jets. He was very cheap on the last year of his contract. It was actually surprising to me that he was traded, but the injuries were piling up for Morgan. He had his best 2 years in Baltimore. Again, I think the Ravens got out a year early. By replacing one tackle this year, the Ravens probably will make the replacement of 2 tackles easier. Now, one of the issues is that if you're a playoff team, very difficult to find a new left tackle because the barriers to entry are so high. And the best way you can usually do it is to have a 2-year plan. So you don't try and get a guy who has to be a starter right away. You pick a guy who's a year away from being a starter that you like for his traits. Maybe he did a little bit in college, but not a guy who's out after 3 years and is Joe Alt or a really dominant offensive lineman. You're not going to get that guy. He's they're always at the top of the draft. And the Ravens, even with an incredibly deep draft of left tackles this year, there was no one left when the Ravens picked at number 30. So they went with Nate Wiggins. And I think that ended up being a good draft pick. Roger Rosengarten played on the right side, everybody says, because Penix is left-handed, and that was the blind side at Washington. So he's really a left tackle in rating. His size and shape would tell you left tackle only. He is a feet guy, so that's a very hard to find, obviously, in the tackles, probably the hardest characteristic, but he mirrors extremely well and also gives ground as he mirrors. He has a really lousy anchor, which is one of the things that could hold him back at the NFL level. So we'll see. He'll get some time at left tackle, right tackle. He may have to step in at left tackle at some point during the season if Ronnie Stanley gets hurt, or they may decide he's not up to it and put Patrick McCary there, as has been okay the last few years when they've had to.
Yeah, and so, sorry, did you mention who do you expect to be playing then in that right tackle role come week 1? Because it might
good question. Yeah. So I think 70% chance that it will be Rosengarten, probably a 30% chance that it might be Fa'alele. They've kept Daniel Fa'alele is still around. They also have Josh Jones, who they've really been looking at guard. He'll be I think the primary backup at both guard spots. But Daniel Fa'alele, he's a 3rd-year developmental tackle. By the way, that's not a good year to be still a developmental player. It's year 3. You want to be a non-developmental player at that point. But anyway, he might get the start, and there's a tremendous bias against having rookies start in Baltimore, and in particular on the offensive line. So even when Orlando Brown was drafted in the 3rd round, he had obviously some holdups in terms of combine effectiveness and metrics and whatnot. So that caused him to slip. But they put James Hurst to tackle for half a season before they gave Brown the job. And Brown, a far better player. I mean, it's no comparison. So they've had a bias over the past. The Ravens always build their depth charts, and it's hilarious to see these 1st round draft picks, labeled as the number 4 tight end on the team and things. It's just, it's kind of ridiculous. But Wiggins will play this year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's good to hear. That's good to hear. And yeah, I guess it's kind of just something that you're going to have to follow through training camp to kind of see who will be the one who's getting, there'll probably be a little bit more revealed through there, but we probably really won't know until week 1. Flipping over, sticking with the offense, want to ask a couple fantasy related questions here just quickly. Derrick Henry, obviously big major addition for this Ravens team in 2024. They lost Gus Edwards, they lost J.K. Dobbins. They love to run the football, and they do well in an NFL that doesn't really like to run the football, where it's not really that meta. So just quickly, how big of a season do you expect from Derrick Henry? And then also, just as a little aside, Keaton Mitchell, he looked like an absolute star last year. He's small, but he's feisty and quick and has that jolt to him. So he only played a few snaps last year before he tore his ACL. I'd read that he wasn't expected to be back in week 1. Do you have like a timeline for when you expect him to be back in 2024 and if he'll be utilized? So just Derrick Henry, tell me a little bit about him, his expectations, and then if Keaton Mitchell maybe can come in and be an impact player this season.
Start with Mitchell. He's the easiest one to respond to. First of all, historic season, the greatest season by DeVoa in NFL history by any back with 40 plus carries. So he was over 8 yards a carry. He's just absurdly productive. Broke tons of tackles, 68% success rate, which if you follow success rate, that's incredible for a running back. The Ravens as a team, by the way, had a 54% success rate running the football, which is otherworldly as a team. Gus Edwards, the guy they let go for Derrick Henry, was the NFL career record holder in success rate at 57.4%. And a lot of that is related, of course, to Lamar Jackson. And the thought is, by the way, I don't expect Keaton Mitchell to play this year. I didn't answer that question. If he does come back, it'll be at the end of the season. It'll be slowly ramped up. If you think of drafting Keaton Mitchell for a fantasy team, I'd caveat emptor, I'd say. Okay. All right. Getting back to Henry, big acquisition, big risk for the Ravens. He's an older back, obviously led the league in carries for the last 5 years. He's a guy who I think the goal is to get him into the mesh and into the risk of that mesh point so that the inside linebackers are truly befuddled. And the way this could really work for the Ravens is open up their play action passing game like never before. But if you force those inside linebackers to basically freeze because you've got the possibility of both Henry and Jackson running on an impending handoff, they don't even have to go all the way into the mesh because they don't usually throw by going in and out of the mesh. But if they even have any sort of forward facing or side fake out of pistol, it'll drive inside linebackers crazy and provide lots of options for their tight ends to make big gains. Henry's also a great pass blocker. I think that's the other big benefit they get. Henry as a runner has not been all that successful the last few years, 46% success rate, which is I heard you mention it before. That gives me extra credibility on this show that you're looking at important metrics like that. But the last 3 years, he's also had some difficulties with the Tennessee offense not really having a good weapon with Tannehill and packed boxes. That won't be the case in Baltimore. They'll be able to, with the speed they have, to threaten defenses vertically and hopefully loosen it up for Henry.
Yeah, all right. Interesting to hear. And so I guess I'm definitely not drafting Keaton Mitchell this year. Going to be interesting to see what Derrick Henry can do in this offense. Sticking with this offense, last question here before we get into expectations. We're in the year two of the Todd Monken offense and in the passing game. The Ravens seem to be comfortable with their pass catchers just based off their offseason moves that they didn't make, right? They lost Odell, but they didn't really look to bring anyone in free agency. They didn't use much capital to bring in any new wide receivers. The kind of only addition they made was Tez Walker in the 4th round. And just sticking with this passing game, Isaiah Likely last season had like I want to call it a mini coming out party when Mark Andrews was hurt last year. So with those two things, are we going to see the Ravens kind of operate a little bit more out of 12 personnel in 2024? Last year, they operated in 12 personnel only 11% of the time, but obviously Mark Andrews was hurt for majority of the season. So it's going to be tough to operate out of 12 personnel when Mark Andrews is hurt. But with the lack of depth at wide receiver, and two very strong pass catching tight ends, is this the year where we see the Ravens utilize 12 personnel more?
I think they will utilize 12 personnel just because there's a lot of mouths to feed in the tight end room, which is the deepest group on the team. It's the most insulated from injury. But if they don't have injuries, you have Andrews and Likely, who are both number one tight ends, and they are both outstanding players and game changers. And I think, the acquisition of Henry and the possibility of play action working for them is great. Last year, okay, let's go to a 2-year history, a little bit of detail on this. In 2022, the Ravens tight ends had 195 targets, but they weren't particularly good because a lot of the marginal targets were going to Andrews, and they were contested balls, a lot of bailout throws, a lot of last chance on extended plays and whatnot, and it tended to be not as good. When Lamar has only one extended target, that's a bad thing. Defenses try to do a better job of keeping track of him. This last year, Lamar was great at mixing the ball around to multiple targets on extended plays. The tight ends had fewer snaps. In fact, the 2022 tight ends were the heaviest team, I believe, in the history of the National Football League. They certainly are the heaviest team in decades in a relative sense, but they use 2.30 tight ends plus fullbacks plus OL6s per play. You got 5 eligible receivers, and they use 2.30 on those positions. The highest had been done in recent years was the 2019 Vikings, who were just under 2 at 199. So I kind of don't think the Ravens are going to get back above 2 this year. They might. If they are, they're again, relying on their heft as much as they possibly can. But 12 personnel tightens up boxes against Henry. There's reasons not to do it. There's other good reasons because it's 2 of your best receivers. You want them on the field. And I'll tell you that the 11% number last year, it may be definitionally low because Patrick Ricard may not be included in it. And he's kind of an inline tight end as opposed to a fullback. But a lot of your 21s were really 12s. So do you have a 21 personnel number there? Yeah, so 23.6 out of 21 personnel would tell me that there's some, that's not entirely Ricard in the backfield. So it's a lot of Ricard in line. It's a crossroads year for Mark Andrews. So he's at a point in his career where he needs to earn not only his 2025 salary, which is significant. They have about an $11 million savings for cutting him next year. But they also, only one of Likely or Andrews is likely to be signed beyond 2025. And all 3 of their tight ends, including Charlie Kolar, are only signed through 2025 or signed through exactly 2025. Let's put it that way. And then Ricard is signed only through this year. There are some people out there, by the way, who think Ricard could still be cut at this point. I don't think it's likely with what they've got going on with Derrick Henry. I think they'll stay with what they are. And I think the Ravens, when you're a dominant team, one you don't always run to get ahead in the game. You're not usually running for EPA. You run to close out games. You play for EPW. And that's one of the big problems with EPA in general is it's miscast in terms of its second half value in defining football. Teams in the second half, every single game, one team wants to get the game the hell over, and the other team wants to catch the hell up. And the team that wants to get the game over is giving up expected points added in exchange for expected wins added, oftentimes with short running plays. And EPA is never really completely satisfied me as an actuary and a football analyst in terms of what it really tells us about football.
Yeah, fair enough here. There's a lot to unpack there. But let's switch over here and just look at some of these odds on FanDuel. The win total right now for the Ravens is 10.5, juice towards the over. For them to win their division, plus 140, to win the conference, plus 500, and to win the Super Bowl, plus 950. Top 3 in odds to win the Super Bowl here. Of course, when you have Lamar Jackson and a high-end defense, the Ravens will always be in the mix, like we mentioned at the beginning of this show. So tell me, What are your expectations as a fan, as an analyst for the team? What are your expectations for the Ravens in 2024?
I do expect this to be a good team. A lot of it will be related to Jackson's health, as it always is. He's the central piece. You always have a chance if he's around. And the other, probably the second most important component, is how the offensive line is able to gel together. Whether they have players who are really as good as they were last year. I think that left guard, 60% chance they do. Right guard, 35%. Zeitler was excellent. And at right tackle, I think the chance is more like 10 to 20%. So it's going to be it's good. There's going to be more on the position players, the skill position players than were last year. But if you give me an over under on wins 10.5, I'd probably take the over on that.
Yeah. And I mean, expectation wise, like, do you think that this team is capable of beating like the likes of Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen, Buffalo, like whichever team they're good? Listen, they're gonna have to go through one of those teams, maybe both of them. Do you think they're built?
What was so frustrating about this last season was they beat everybody by historic levels. They beat the 49ers. They beat the Dolphins 56-19 or whatever it was. They beat they didn't beat Kansas City. That was the one team they didn't play during the regular season. But they beat their divisional opponents, except for the Steelers. One of the games they weren't really playing. They beat the Lions. They beat the Seahawks by big margins. They beat everybody. And they had the most wins in NFL history against the teams that had winning records. So it's hard to say this team can't win the big one. They didn't win the AFC Championship at home. It was incredibly disappointing. But I don't think I'd look at that and say I don't think the 2024 Ravens are still a contender. I do think they will not be as good as they were last year.
Yeah, and it's just like a trust the process thing, right? Like it's a tough sport. It's a game. You only play one game, and there's plenty of outcomes that can happen in that one game. So it's hard to be the winner. So yeah, some people smirk at that phrase, trust the process. But again, Ravens are doing everything right. So just kind of have to stick with it and trust the process there. So that does it for us today. Let us know your thoughts on the 2024 Ravens in the comment section down below. Make sure you check out Ken McKusick on X at Film Study Ravens. And Ken, quickly, if you want to plug for me, you have an expectation series. You want to just mention what that's about on your pod?
Sure. The expectation series is a deep dive into two players, one offense and one defense, per day. Shows run about an hour each, so they are very thorough and detailed if you're a Ravens fan.
Yeah, if you're a Ravens fan, completely granular, awesome stuff to get into if you're really interested in that stuff. Or if you're interested in specific players like Derrick Henry, like Lamar Jackson, you can just check out those specific episodes as well. Head over to his YouTube page, Film Study Ravens, or just find him on Twitter at Film Study Ravens. All the links are there. If you made it this far, guess what? That means you like our content, so please press that like button. It goes a long way for us. And if you enjoy this content and you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We're previewing all 32 NFL teams as we get closer to training camp. So make sure you turn on notifications when you subscribe so you never miss out on our newest content. If you're not into notifications, there'll be a button on your screen. Click that playlist, bookmark that playlist. You'll never miss out on our newest content. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. We'll see you in the next one.